Hi. We're going to talk a little bit now about the different types of values that we argue with, right? Because sometimes when we're making value claims, it's obvious that that's a matter of like personal preference. That's my personal taste or my value. And at other times when we're arguing, we want to be able to argue with other people about something that is right or wrong, good or bad, just or unjust. And as we do that, we have to shift how we're understanding what we mean by good or bad in each particular case. So, for instance, we're going to start with public values, things that we typically would argue about with other members of a public. Now, as we're thinking about what counts as a public, those are other people within your society. So when we think about arguing about laws or something with the public, we're talking about other citizens who have an influence on those laws or have a stake in those laws, right? People who are affected by them. Now, as we start arguing then in other publics, let's say we're arguing with people in other nations, other cultures, other societies, that might be a broader definition of what the public is. And we always have to find a commonality with that public in order to have a common basis to make an evaluation. So when we create our criteria, we need to understand who we are creating that criteria with, right? So let's start off with just. We've already talked about laws. We can say like saying a law is legal, well, that's redundant, right? It's the law. But saying a law is just or unjust requires an evaluation. So the first place we find those kind of public values that we argue about is arguing within a particular political context. So we argue within the political context something that is politically good or bad, we talk about as being just or unjust. Right? And there might be other terms that we use, but generally what it comes down to is it's a just law or an unjust law. This draws, we might use fair, right? But just is a more kind of technical term for it. So just or unjust. Now, when we're looking for those standards of justice, then we have to kind of come up with those common sorts of standards, those common documents that might supersede the law, the basis of the laws that we have. And so we would come up with some sort of standard to share about what counts as justice or what counts as a just law to be able to say this one is or is not a just law. Now, that's different though than saying something is good or bad in a moral sense. So I might say slavery is unjust, that it's an unfair punishment because it violates the nature of human rights. I might say slavery is just because it at least in some contexts, right, forced labor as a punishment is a punishment for a particular crime. And then so a short term of slavery then might, defining that, count as something that is just. So we could argue about whether or not it fits that standard. Now, if I say slavery is immoral, what I'm not saying is like, well, there's a justness or a kind of fairness to it. What I'm saying is that it violates a different type of good or bad. So when we look at morality, we're looking at something different. So as justice is about kind of that relationship between the government or who makes laws with respect to the people. When we talk about issues of sort of ethics, we're looking at a slightly different relationship. So when we're looking at ethics, we're talking about something that's moral or immoral. And we're not looking at necessarily the relationship between the power structure, the people who are making the rules, and the people who are under those rules. We're looking instead about the relationship between one person and another. So I might say, even if I believe or could argue that slavery is just under certain circumstances, I could also still argue in a different sense that slavery is immoral in another circumstance, because that has a relationship between people and other people, right? So the relationship or the connection between people. So how I, as one human being, interact and treat another human being. Now, we could argue about whether or not it's immoral to have slaves. We could also, though, argue about whether it's beneficial to have slaves. Right? It could be argued, for instance, that it is beneficial to an economy to have slaves. It is useful. And so we have other kinds of terms we talk about as being beneficial or useful or productive or influential, those kinds of things. And what I kind of group those under is a term we'd call like the practical values. And there we use a lot of different kinds of terms. Like I said, beneficial, effective, or the opposites, obviously, ineffective, unbeneficial, harmful, safe, right? Those are all count as different types of kind of practical values. And the way we judge those is typically on some sort of economic, in a general sense, an economic kind of scale, the relationship between ends and means. Is this the most efficient or effective tool to do this particular job, right? Am I getting enough benefit out of it to justify the costs of it? And that's where we can kind of look at things in beneficial and a more practical way. So we have different kinds of values that we would talk about. Now, each one of those is something that makes a lot of sense to argue about publicly. If we're choosing like, which is a better rule, what is a better system, what is a more effective law, right? And I could say, for instance, let's go to mask laws with the coronavirus, right? Masks are effective or ineffective. We could argue about those. But can I, require people to have masks? Can I require mask wearing? Well, that's a question of justice, just or unjust. What kind of abilities does the government have? What abilities doesn't the government have? How should they use those? Should I, as an individual who's not concerned about my safety, wear a mask even though I'm so concerned about the safety of other people? Now, that's an ethical kind of judgment. So we can kind of shift that sphere for how we're talking under different sorts of circumstances. All of those are public values that we typically argue about, and most of our public arguments would fit in one of those different types of areas. Or you might be arguing within more than one of those types of areas. Now, that's going to be different than the other side. We're going to talk a little bit about those private values, things that we don't argue about, and that's where we find some of those differences. So I'm going to go ahead and move this guy over here. And now let's talk about what we call private. And this doesn't mean necessarily that we can't argue about them, but that they're limited to a particular sphere, right? That we can't argue, or we don't typically argue about them with other members of the public. So probably the most private value we have has to do with our own personal preferences or taste. So we call that, I jumped a little bit for us. Let's grab it and bring it back. Thank you. So when we talk about taste, what we talk about there, or preference, we're talking about the appetites. So we use that as kind of appetitive values. Right? So our appetitive values have to do with our relationship between us and our taste. Right? Person to self is that connection. And so we use things like I like or I don't like. So for instance, my favorite candy of the fall, at least, is candy corn, right? And maybe you're like, ooh, candy corn, that's disgusting. That's like a wad of wax with sugar grit in it. Gross. I hate that. Ugh, why would I ever want that? But I'm like, no, it's really good. I really like it. But how my liking of it can't affect you in any way, right? I might get you to try it. Like, no, try like a nice piece of candy corn. You might try it and be like, nope, don't like it. Okay, that's as much as I can possibly argue. I can't come up with a reason why your tastes might change. Now, that might be different in different circumstances. Like I might say, oh, I like this kind of music. I appreciate this kind of music. That's what I enjoy listening to. And you might listen to it and say like, nah, it's not really my style. I can try and get you used to it and be like, well, I can share a few things, but if you like it or don't like it, that's entirely up to you. I can't come up with reasons you should like it. I can maybe help you get used to it, and you might find an appreciation for it. But generally speaking, when we start looking at other things like beyond like food or personal preference kind of things, what I find may be comfortable or uncomfortable, then we get into arguing about something in the terms of its aesthetics, right? Is it beautiful in some way? Is it well crafted, right? That's really a different kind of argument. And so we often kind of use that kind of appetitive a little too much. What we're really talking about when we start talking about like music or art or things like that is we're talking about aesthetic values. when we're talking about aesthetic values, it comes down to some sense of like beauty or craftsmanship. Now, this is where the standard, even though we kind of consider it personal or kind of a more a private value, it works within a particular range or within a particular field, right? So when we're looking at types of music, for instance, you wouldn't judge hip hop by the same standard you'd use to judge classical music, right? I can appreciate classical music and I can appreciate some hip hop, even if I don't particularly like either one, but I can understand what makes it beautiful, how it makes good classical music, something that is well prepared, well performed, well written. I can also look at something that makes good hip hop, something that's well prepared, well written, has a strong message. Like all of those different kinds of things might go into my judgment, but that judgment is within a particular field. So it'd be in this case the kind of the work that we're talking about in its relationship to a particular domain. But one of the things we run into is that idea that there's like kind of that connection between aesthetic and appetitive, right? You try to use those interchangeably, even though they're different. So appetitive, always think of like something like I really like coffee, right? Whereas aesthetic is I really can appreciate the craftsmanship of this art, right? So like if you've ever been to an art museum, for instance, you could look around and say like that is an amazing painting. That is like incredible. It has a powerful message. It's wonderful. And I would never, ever in a million years hang that sucker on my wall. It's disgusting, right? Like I don't like it, but I can appreciate it, right? I can listen to some opera, for instance, and say like, that is incredibly well done. I can see the talent, the ability of the people there. It's not my thing though, right? I'm not going to like hang out and put that on my playlist. So that's the kind of difference between that aesthetic and the appetitive. And notice people do overuse that appetitive. We try and make every value judgment an appetite. Well, like I just don't like slavery. It's just not my thing. All right. Like, no, that's not what you're saying. When you're talking about slavery, when you're talking about something that affects other people, you want a common judgment, right? So that's why we use ethical or political values to talk about it. When we're talking about art or something like that, we confine it to a sphere where it makes sense to look at that artwork, right? And as we criticize art or music or anything else on that aesthetic level, that typically you use a certain kind of critical standard that people have adopted over time. Like just anything gets to be hung in a museum, even if we sometimes look at things and go like, I could have done that, right? But there's standards that the art community uses, and so that's where it's field specific for their evaluation. One of the last ones that we might look at, and this is another one that has a lot of crossover, is what we call theological values. So theological values have to do with something that is good or bad, right or wrong in that kind of ultimate or religious sense. So we typically think of that as like a religious context. And what we're usually talking about, even though we don't use the word very often when we're talking theological values, is piety. Now, piety and religious values have to do with the relationship between a person and whatever you hold to be kind of the ultimate good standard in your world. That's generally what you consider your God, right? Right. And I use that in that sense because some religions obviously have a God, right? There's a God or have a particular deity that I think of, or some religions have more than one deity. Some, even people who think that, well, I'm not a religious person, but they often have like a particular value set. So for instance, I was listening to a speech or a kind of commentary that the Dalai Lama was giving. He's a Buddhist, right? He doesn't have a kind of God ultimately that he was talking about, but he was talking about nature, right? And so his ultimate good that he was talking about was balance and harmony with nature, right? So things are theologically good when they are in balance and harmony with the natural world. So that's what he holds as his ultimate good. Now, that might then have influence on the sorts of ethical values you have or the sorts of just political values you have. So those theological values often influence these other kinds of values.
Good morning, Saints. Cast and crew of the World's their opening night event has been rescheduled for this Sunday, November.
Sorry about that. So our theological values might influence our ethical values, or they might have an influence on kind of other elements like our political values, right? So as we're looking at those different types of values and we're thinking about like what makes something good or bad for me, might be that I have influence by my theological values. Or I might find that in fact my feelings about justice have an influence over what sorts of theological values I hold to be true. It could influence one another. One of the key things, though, to kind of keep in mind, you want to avoid doing is trying to make everything simply a matter of personal preference and make your appetitive values be the things that determine all of these other elements, right? Often, though, we use our appetitive values to judge what we like or think is good or bad in art, right? So you'll often have people maybe criticize your music and say, oh, that's not music, that's garbage, I hate it. It's like they just don't have an appreciation for the particular kind of aesthetic that your music is. And so you can use that as a way to come back at them for not liking your particular music. It's not just a matter of your preference. It has a particular aesthetic quality to it. It's well crafted, it's well put together. But anytime we're going to be arguing about those values, the first thing to do is identify what kind of values that we're using. If we're talking about a person, for instance, is that person good or bad because of what the person did politically? Is a person an example of justice? Is the person a good role model, right? That might be get us into some ethical kind of values. Was the person particularly successful, beneficial, or effective in his or her field? And that's going to get us to those practical kinds of values. So whatever sort of value you're looking at, as you're looking at a person, what they did, make sure you understand how to evaluate those kinds of values and be clear about what you're doing and what you're actually arguing about when you're saying someone or something is good or bad. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.